All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk, and thank you, Lynn, for that nice introduction. I'm going to talk today about, we're kind of focusing on interpersonal problems, and so the disorder that I study primarily is, there are definitely many interpersonal problems that are associated with the disorder. But I also wanted to tie into, instead of just looking at interpersonal problems, tie into emotion dysregulation, because many people believe this is a disorder of emotion dysregulation. And in fact, what I'll argue is that if it may be that emotion dysregulation actually drives some of the interpersonal problems that we see, but at the very least, I think these are intertwined such that it's kind of hard to tease them apart at times. On the method side, I'm going to take you on a little journey from just kind of survey methods to what we use more now in our lab, which is ambulatory assessment methods, which enable us to actually study people in their natural environments, or as I say here, in the wild, which is a little sexier to say, I guess. All right. So here's the general outline. It's pretty busy. When I put it together, I thought, wow, how am I going to get through this? I do tend to talk fast, so please slow me down if I'm talking too fast. If I talk too slow, well, see how it goes, but if it looks like I'm putting myself to sleep, throw something at me and wake me up. But basically, what I'm going to cover here, I'm just going to briefly talk about BPD and the interpersonal problems that are associated with it. I then want to talk a little bit about a recent review about social cognition problems associated with BPD, and also how that ties into emotion dysregulation. Then I'm going to pose a question to you: how do we actually study dynamic processes like affective instability and maybe instability in how you relate to other people? I'm going to make a case for using ambulatory assessment methods. I'll talk about some of our studies using electronic diaries. Also a study that used something called the ear, which is it records audio in a person's, their ambient sounds in their environment. And finally, I'll end with talking about some of our more current stuff where we're trying to study people in the wild using other types of devices, namely smartphones, sensor devices, and building wireless body area networks. So here we go. BPD is a very severe personality disorder. It's been recognized for decades and decades, and it turns out that it's quite prevalent. Comparing it to something like schizophrenia, which is present in about 1% of the population, our best estimates suggest that this disorder is present in about 1 to 3% of the general population. If you look at outpatient samples, about 10% of outpatient samples would meet diagnostic criteria for this. 20% of inpatients, it is the most commonly diagnosed personality disorder. It's highly comorbid, that is, it co-occurs with a lot of other psychiatric conditions like anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and substance use disorders, and it's associated with many poor outcomes. We'll talk about interpersonal problems, but the ultimate poor outcome is completed suicide, and estimates suggest 8 to 10% of those with this disorder would complete suicide. So this is a very serious problem. Now, as it turns out, in some ways, it's a disorder of instability. So like 4 features here. You have affective instability. People's emotions change from hour to hour, moment to moment, and it's very unpredictable. You also see unstable interpersonal relationships. So even within the same dyad, there may be kind of a different stance from one moment to the next, and we talk about splitting is one term, but seeing somebody as sort of idealized partner and then a devalued partner. And then you see this across relationships as well. I'm not going to talk much about it, but also you'll have unstable impulsive behavior and this instability in self-image. So we're going to focus on the first two, given the theme of the talks here. Gunderson, who's probably seen as, I don't know if you call it the father of borderline personality disorder, but certainly he is seen as one of the most important figures in the study of this disorder. But he really sees BPD is primarily having this sort of, he called it an interpersonal phenotype. And the way he would describe this interpersonal style, is it's very paradoxical, it's contradictory, and it's a combination of this intense need for closeness and attention, but at the same time, equally intense fears of rejection or abandonment. So you can imagine if somebody is in this position where on the one hand, they really have this intense, strong need to engage with others, be attached to others, yet at the same time, they're afraid of rejection or abandonment. And as we'll talk about, there are other things about sort of reading malevolent intentions into sort of neutral situations. So this real interpersonal ambivalence that ends up resulting in a lot of interpersonal problems. You do see this reflected in a couple of diagnostic features specifically, so frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, unstable, intense interpersonal relationships, but also it's important to recognize that many of the other features of BPD are actually sort of manifest themselves in an interpersonal context. So for example, a lot of people with this disorder engage in self-harm, and that may be done in an interpersonal context, maybe suicidal behavior, whether or not it's threatening suicide or actually making attempts, and also emotion, reactivity, and outbursts. So even the other features that we think about with BPD seem to come out or manifest themselves in this interpersonal context as well. Now, just to start off with, and just to show you that you see this even in the general population. Like I said before, our best estimates are that maybe 1% to 3% of the general population suffer from this disorder. These are data from the NESARC epidemiological study some of you are probably familiar with, but at this wave 2 of assessment, there are about 34,000 individuals in the US, and they kind of weight the data so that it's sort of representative of the general population. We were able to look at borderline diagnoses here, and so just a simple question here is, having this disorder, even in a non-clinical sample, is it associated with more interpersonal problems than those that don't have the disorder in the last 12 months? So these are sort of frequency counts or prevalence rates over the previous 12 months of assessment. And as you can see, in every case, you have about from 4 times to 7 times as great a chance of these negative interpersonal outcomes if you have this or diagnosed with this disorder versus not, whether it's separation or divorce, trouble with boss, or serious problems with a neighbor, friend, or relative. So the reason why I show this is just to take it out of a clinical context, because once somebody's already in a clinical context, they kind of come there for the interpersonal problems often. But here, even in the general population, we see evidence for some increased risk, if you will, for these interpersonal problems. Now, so what might be operating here? Why is it that people with BPD are more vulnerable, let's say, to interpersonal problems? And one place to look for an answer to this question is in the field of social cognition. So basically, this field kind of takes a look at when people interact with each other, there's certain kind of basic mechanisms, and if they're intact, it probably makes it easier for people to interact with each other. And if there's some problems there, obviously that may lead to conflict, interpersonal problems. So you have both senders of social signals and receivers of social signals. There are 2 parts to this. The social signals here would be language, your facial expression, bodily gestures. It's believed these can be conscious or unconscious. Hopefully your language is conscious, but certainly the facial expression and bodily gesture might be unconscious. And one thing that's it seems like there's a big focus on the construct of empathy, because that seems to cover a lot of the landscape of social cognition. And specifically, this is broken down by some into cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. So cognitive empathy really amounts to perspective taking. So are you able to report what the other person is thinking, what their intentions are, and so forth? So here, when we study this, we look at for accuracy or bias. in making some attribution to another's mental state. So you can imagine, like, if you're not able to do that well, that could be problematic for you. We also break it down into emotional empathy. So this involves one's emotional responses to another one's emotional state. And just to make it kind of easy, you could think if somebody's overly reactive to someone else's emotions, that could cause problems. Or if they're really underreactive to that, that could cause problems in that interpersonal interaction. Now this is beautiful. It's a nice figure, but so I'm putting this talk together, and lo and behold, these guys have a nice figure that summarizes the literature on social cognition in BPD. Perfect. So on this side, you can see people with this disorder as receivers of social signals. And what we find, kind of aggregating across studies, is that there's evidence for reduced cognitive empathy. So in other words, people with this disorder compared to others without have more difficulty inferring accurately others' emotional states, their thoughts, and their intentions. And there are also evaluation biases here, such that there's kind of a negative evaluation bias. So the kind of people with BP tend to assume more negative things, more malevolent intentions, let's say, even in the face of neutral stimuli. Likewise, we see impairment in emotional empathy. So here, it's hard for those with BPD to, again, feel or get a sense of what the other person is feeling and to do that accurately and behave accordingly. We also have a smaller literature on people with this disorder as senders of social signals. And this is kind of fascinating, but there are some studies now that suggest those with this disorder tend to show less facial activity during interactions. And you can imagine if you're the receiver there, it's kind of harder to know kind of what they're thinking, what's going on, so that's likely to cause some problems. There are fewer positive and more mixed and hard to read facial emotional expressions, especially during social threat. So unfortunately, it looks like the double whammy here. So there's some problems both with being a receiver of social signals as well as a sender of social signals. These two, as you might guess, can sort of conspire together or independently to create a lot of problems in social relationships. So exactly what we're talking about, interpersonal conflicts, and then these other sorts of behaviors or symptoms that we often see in an interpersonal context, like suicidal behavior. And also another hallmark feature is that people with this disorder tend to have trouble maintaining long-term relationships. Now, I also want to point you to this, because this will be, especially this one, will be very important today. The studies that have been done on BPD as those with BPD as receivers of social signals, it looks like those that have a history of childhood trauma or a history of PTSD, a current PTSD, this seems to impair their ability even more so. So, and you can maybe make a case out of that, a rationale that if you've had these sorts of trauma in your background, you'd probably be maybe less likely to trust others, and so be more vulnerable to such evaluation biases. The other thing that's really interesting here, and this is where it really ties into this talk, is that in situations of high arousal, high negative arousal, or affective instability, this seems to also impact or make worse one's ability to receive these social signals, which in turn then lead to more high arousal. So you got a cyclical pattern there. They kind of feed into each other. Okay. So this is a very nice way of kind of summarizing the literature. It gives us some ideas about potential mechanisms for, it's one thing to say people have interpersonal problems. A lot of people have, all of us have interpersonal problems, some more than others. But here we have some ideas from laboratory studies as to what some of the potential mechanisms are. All right. I've already kind of covered this, but again, I'm going to highlight and make a case for the importance of emotion dysregulation or high negative arousal states, that really being part of this system here that leads to interpersonal problems. So does one cause the other? I think you could make a case either way. You could think about how having a bad interpersonal interaction would make you more angry, so that's kind of affective instability. But you could also think that, well, perhaps the more unstable your mood is, you enter into an interaction kind of not in a good place, and it makes it more likely that you're going to have problems in that interpersonal interaction. So I'm not going to be able to answer that question today, unfortunately, but what I hope is that by showing you some of the methods that we use, we're starting to be able to kind of tease these things apart a little bit, primarily because we're using methods that are sort of time dependent, and so we can see what leads to what. Most of the studies in this area are kind of cross-sectional, either laboratory studies or survey studies, but you can't really tease apart what causes what, only that the two kind of go together. Okay, so some early data that maybe have some implications for this question. This was a study I did years ago, and basically we selected people that were high in borderline features, actually college students here at MU. We assessed them at age 18, and then we assessed them again 2 years later. In this study, we were looking at major components of borderline personality disorder. So affective instability, emotion dysregulation, impulsivity, identity problems, and here, negative relationships. So this was our measure of interpersonal problems, if you will. This is the best fitting model. What we wanted to do is to try to predict basically from wave 1 to wave 2, and we looked at a variety of different models where one or two components would be used to predict changes or increases in problems in these areas 2 years later. This best fitting model suggests that it's affective instability, some type of negative emotion dysregulation that predicts increases in impulsivity, identity problems, and problems in relationships 2 years later, above and beyond what can be predicted just by the stability of these over time. So this doesn't answer the question, but at least it's suggestive that sort of this affective instability or emotional reactivity component is quite important, and it may, at least over 2 years, lead to an increase in problems with relationships. Okay. This is a model of emotion dysregulation, negative emotion dysregulation that Ryan Carpenter and I talked about recently, and it's basically Linehan's model of borderline personality disorder, and I think it has something to say about why there may be interpersonal problems or some deficits in some of those mechanisms we talked about. The idea here is that people with this disorder really are born with a high degree of emotion sensitivity. And when I say born, I mean there's a genetic predisposition or some biological predisposition for that. So they're predisposed to react strongly with their emotions, usually negative emotions, to the world out there. Some kind of stimulus, now this could be an interpersonal interaction or some event, and as a function of this vulnerability, there's some event or experience, and this leads to heightened and labile negative affects. So here's where I'm talking about affective instability. This is where it happens. Then, according to this model, you kind of face there are two different paths, and you can take either path or both paths, but the idea is that for people with this disorder, they tend to have either inadequate, appropriate regulation strategies. So for most of us, if we get really upset, we have some degree of distress tolerance. So we can kind of cope with it. It kind of, it solves itself eventually. People with this disorder do not have high distress tolerance. So when they get distressed, they get more anxious, more angry, more sad, whatever, and it just kind of feeds into itself. So that's one path. The other one here, in addition to not having adequate or appropriate strategies, they are prone to engage in maladaptive regulation strategies, things like rumination. If you ruminate about something negative, guess what? That's not going to make you feel better. I'll go ahead and give you that hint. Try it at home, but it's not going to work, okay? I'm pretty confident about that. Or people sometimes just avoid the emotional experience. That doesn't work either. Or they try to suppress the emotional experience. Those things are known to kind of have like a rebound effect almost. So we see those sorts of strategies that are used with people with this disorder. And as a function of that, we have what we were calling emotion dysregulation consequences, which could be interpersonal conflicts, suicidal behavior, and so forth. So there's several places in this model where I think some of the interpersonal stuff that we've talked about can fit. So this kind of begs the question, like, okay, you've convinced me there's affective instability there, there's some instability in interpersonal relationships. How do we study that? And so this was actually a question that really kind of hit me in the early 2000s. It took me a while for this to hit me, but it hit me then. Because the traditional way of studying this stuff is to ask people, like, how are your moods stable or not? Well, that seems reasonable, but the problem is people meaning us, we're terrible historians. We're terrible personal historians. And in fact, we've done studies where we've showed that people are not able to remember well even really bad events that happened within the last week. So when we've monitored people for a whole week in real time or near real time, we ask them when they come back in about Tuesday or whatever, they're terrible. It's like a correlation of 0 almost. So that doesn't, and also another approach that people have used, there are popular questionnaires out there, and we found that these questionnaires show low and at best moderate correlations with real-time assessments of affective instability. Likewise, when you think about an unstable interpersonal process, how do you assess that? Again, typically it's a more global assessment, retrospective assessment, and I would argue that might be good as a screener, but ultimately that's not going to tell you the whole story. It's not going to be as accurate. Also, where do we study this stuff? Typically it's studied in the lab or in a big room like this, and we give everyone questionnaires and they hand it in to us and we code. I do it too, so I'm not knocking that, but that's how we typically do it. However, and we do it by retrospective self-report, but what I'm arguing is that if we really want to try to understand dynamic processes and how these unfold in the real world, then we need to use a method that can do that. And for the most part, that hasn't been done a lot. So that led me to ecological momentary assessment, which I'm going to also talk about something called ambulatory assessment, which I see as a bigger umbrella, but the first studies I'll talk about are kind of EMA studies. For those of you that don't know, it's very idiographic in focus. We collect data in real-world environments, so we're asking people to report on their experience as they're going about their daily lives. The assessments focus on their current or very recent states or behaviors. And these assessments, you can do all kinds of things. You can make them event-based. So I can say, every time you drink, log it in and tell me what's going on. Or every time you have a fight with your romantic partner, log it in and tell me what's going on. Or we can do random prompts, where it just makes a sound, and then people answer questions. So we get all kinds of data there. And the important thing is that we get multiple assessments on each individual over time. And the studies that I'll show you at first, we had about 168 assessments on people over a month. So this is very different than, kind of traditional psychological research where you might have one assessment. Some have called this an intensive longitudinal method. So they're longitudinal studies, but often they're separated by 6 months or a year. Here, our assessments sometimes are separated by just a few hours and over many days in a row. So, initially, when I focused on affective instability with this method because, again, it's seen as a hallmark feature of BPD. it lends itself to this method because if you think about an unstable, how can you not consider time or do repeated measures if you're going to characterize an unstable process? You can't count on people to tell you. You can't even count on them to tell you what they did last Tuesday, much less what their moods are like over the course of time. It's just something that we humans are not very good at doing. So with affective instability and BPD, what we see is that typically there's a general state of negative affectivity, and then we have spikes in negative affect, usually hostility, fear or panic, and then sadness. And these states can last hours or a day and are assumed to be triggered by environmental events. Hey, interpersonal stuff, potentially. Now, I'm going to talk about affective instability, but you could talk about interpersonal instability as well here. So components of instability in general. You're interested in looking over the course of time how large changes are, how frequently do changes occur, and very importantly, temporal dependency. That is, how predictable is one mood state from the previous mood state or one other kind of state. So here, these are real data from one individual with BPD. This person was rating negative affect, and so it went up to 28 days. Each dot represents an assessment. There were 6 assessments a day, and the lines are just helping us go from the average each day to the next day. As you can see, hopefully, this is an unstable process. A stable process, which of course you would never see, would be just a flat line. But here we have large amplitude changes. You can point to many examples of this, and rating negative affect on a scale of 1 to 5. We also see many of these over time, so not just one big spike and that's it. And importantly, if you were to just think about some of these data points, if you're right here and you had to predict where the next mood rating was going to be, you probably wouldn't predict up here. So it's unpredictable in a sense, and that's kind of the hallmark of instability. So in this study of affective instability, we gave people Palm Pilots like that. This looks really cool, I'm sure. They no longer make these because nobody wants them. They're dead in my lab. But at the time, they were high tech, okay? But anyway, so we would give these Palm Pilots to 2 different patient groups, BPD outpatients that had affective instability, and my control group here, they weren't healthy controls, but rather I wanted to see, can I distinguish those with BPD from individuals with high levels of negative affect in general? And so I chose a depressed outpatient group. Because if I want to see if the instability, it's not just the fact that you have high negative affect and everyone with high negative affect is all over the place, or is it that this is kind of unique to BPD? So there you go. This is the cool screenshot. But basically, we use PANAS items, and people rated them on a scale of 1 to 5 on each screen. This is the initial result, or for this study, we had 60 participants, about half and half here. And you can see these are not just worried well individuals. 63% had had a previous psychiatric hospitalization, a lot of comorbidity, and, a lot of dysfunction, if you will, or impairment in this sample. We're interested in negative affect, positive affect, and then the specific affects that, again, I said, are kind of defined in the DSM as far as kind of the different sorts of affective instability that you might see. Like I said, I'm going to skip. I've deleted a lot of real technical stuff just to give you the down low here, but basically you had almost on average like 168 prompts. I will tell you a pleasant surprise was that on average people are about 90% compliant. So I remember the granting agency, some of the reviewers said, oh, they're going to pick it up and throw it, or they're going to go sell it, at the pawn shop. It didn't happen, other than the people sitting on it or, getting it wet by accidentally swimming with it or whatever, we didn't really lose that many palms. So this turned out actually pretty well. But with these data, we used multi-level models to test some of these assumptions, and the basic results here is that if you looked at just the mean levels of these affects, they did not distinguish the two diagnostic groups. So kind of for the reason that I included the two, it's like they both have high levels of negative affect when you just go over time, the whole study. However, the variance and variability of all affect scores differed significantly between the two groups. Specifically, there was more variability in all affect scores for BPD folks versus those with depression. However, a little minor point here, but it turns out that just looking at variance, that's not a good way of assessing this because that doesn't take the moment-to-moment change into account, especially that temporal dependency issue. So we came up with some used some alternative measures to look at instability, the mean squared successive difference, and something that we came up with, the PAC, the probability of acute change. Specifically, and I apologize, there it is. It's very small though. So these pluses indicate acute change. And so basically, from one moment to the next, if the amount that your mood score changed was in the upper 90th percentile of all the changes of all the subjects, then that counted as a big change. And so you can see for this subject, there are a lot of big changes. In fact, 20% of the times where there was, from moment to moment, there was a big change. So that's a lot, like 1/5 of the time, big change in affect. The MSSD simply takes the difference between one moment to the next, that difference, and squares it. And then you can take the mean of that over time to get an overall index of how much things are kind of bouncing around. So when we used the squared successive difference in our models, we found that there was greater instability for the BPD patients on hostility, fear, and sadness compared to our depressed folks. And when we looked at just the probability of acute change, we only found evidence for hostility. And I think you can make a case for why that is. So the really big changes really happened for that kind of anger outburst stuff, which is pretty characteristic of this disorder. Okay, so just to summarize that initial study, the variability of scores differentiates between the two. You do have instability and negative mood scores, and then these large acute changes in hostility. Now, let's bring it back to interpersonal problems. So we have a method that seems to be able to do a decent job of quantifying instability based on people's reports while they're out in their natural world. And we've used it with mood, so now that kind of opens up things for us where we can also look at perhaps instability in interpersonal relationships, or at the very least, the relationship between unstable mood and interpersonal conflicts, or as we'll see, perceptions of rejection by your romantic partner. So this is based on Whitney Brown's master's thesis, and so this is the full sample here. Importantly, we were looking just at those that had a romantic partner while they were being assessed with our Palm Pilot, and this was about the same number, about 80% in both groups. And you can see how there's a disagreement, but we had other things we looked at. I'm going to skip over a lot of stuff, but the important one here, what distinguished the BPD folks from those with depression is that they had a higher percentage of assessments indicating disagreeing with others, feeling let down, and importantly, feeling rejected by a romantic partner. So compared to those with major depression, on more occasions in their assessment, they endorsed this. Okay, so maybe we can then kind of piece some things together. And in particular, we were focusing on this perceived rejection by a romantic partner and hostility, because again, that has more of an interpersonal flair, if you will, that negative affect. And what we wanted to do here, instead of just looking only concurrently or across the whole study, and looking correlationally like what's going on, is it the case that we can back up to the previous day and predict the next day's feelings of rejection from like this kind of disruption or this dysregulation of hostility? So here we're kind of interested in sort of this lag effect. And so what we are doing in this model, certainly fortunately, we found that today's MSSD of hostility, so that instability of hostility for each day, that was associated with, or you could use it to predict how many endorsements of feeling rejected by romantic partner concurrently. Interestingly, when you went the day before, we found that the instability of hostility, controlling for today's hostility, could predict the feelings of rejections by romantic partner. So that suggested that it was almost perhaps driven, like your mood state or the unstable mood state the day before made you vulnerable to or set you up for feeling rejected by your romantic partner the next day. Interesting. Okay. Now, it's a fuzzy picture too. It's good. Thus far, what I've talked about involves people telling us what they're like, what they're feeling like, what their perceptions are. And there's certainly value to that. In fact, that can be very important as far as our models of psychopathology and predicting outcome and so forth. At the same time, it's always nice to have a convergence of methods as well. And so the electronically activated recorder, this big lunky thing here, which now people just run it on their iPods, I think iPods or iTouch. But at the time, we got the big lunky things. This device, it's an ambulatory assessment device developed by social psychologists. And the idea is that, or not what it does is that, unbeknownst to the person wearing it, it takes 50-second snippets of ambient sound in their environment. And usually get like I think it's about 2 or 3 of these an hour. So once they get used to it, they wear it around, and it just comes on and records whatever's out there. Now that might sound kind of weird, but there's some evidence that even from those small samples of sound, you can code and accurately, like what people are, their location, what they're doing, type of interaction, certain affective behaviors. And what we were interested in that hadn't been done before at that time was that we had our coders listen to these sound clips, and then if somebody's emitting some sound, whether it's a sigh or crying or actually talking, we had them rate their affect. Okay? So, what this is doing for us, again, is that it's a different perspective than momentary self-report, because this will bypass this problem due to maybe some recollection bias, limits to self-awareness, inability to aggregate information. It's passively sort of given to us, and then we record or code the sounds. Okay. So in this, I'm just going to show you a few analyses from this study, but basically the first question, of course, is like, how well can you code this, really? You're just 50 seconds? I mean, come on. Well, it turns out you can learn a lot from 50 seconds. What we're going to look at is like the status of either being alone or being with other people. And our coders were very good at determining that. And you might say that, well, that's pretty obvious. Like, can you hear somebody there or they're talking about somebody? Good, okay, yeah, we can do that. With regard to affect, this was something we weren't sure about, because can you really rate affect from just sounds coming out? And our coders agreed pretty well on both a general negative affect as well as this angry, hostile, irritable quality. 2 slides from this that I'll show. This analysis, we were interested in comparing those with BPD, those with MDD, and their ratings, the coders' ratings of their negative affect when they were alone, so people were making sounds or talking when they were alone, doing something, and also when they were with others. 2 points here. First, there's no difference, significant difference between MDD and BPD as far as what the rating of negative affect when they were alone. However, when they were with others, we see significantly lower ratings of negative affect in those with depression versus those with BPD. And this represents an interaction where there's a significant decrease in negative affect for the depressed folks from the status of being alone to when they're with others. So this suggests that in the presence of others, it looks like there's maybe some relief of negative affect for those with depression, whereas for our BPD folks, it doesn't seem to matter whether they're with others or alone. Same thing for hostility here. There's no significant difference here between the two, anger alone. But we do see a difference. There are higher anger ratings for the BPD folks when they're with others than the depressed folks. And we also see that significant drop for the depressed folks, changing status from when they're alone to when they're with others. Now, again, these are across the whole study. So the question becomes, well, can you look at lagged effects to see if affect might predict whether or not you're going to go be with people or you're going to isolate yourself? And so we were able to sort of aggregate things, and we basically looked at the previous 30 minutes and then the current 30 minutes, looked at negative affect and whether or not they were in the presence of others. And basically, this is for the depressed group. The important thing here is that there was a significant effect of lagged negative affect 30 minutes before and whether or not they were with others, such that with this negative sign, essentially this meant that it's more likely that people would not go to be with others the higher their negative affect was for the depressed group. We didn't find that for the BPD group. So in other words, it didn't seem to matter, if you will. They weren't motivated, perhaps, at least partially, by their level of negative affect in the decision about whether or not they were going to be with others. And perhaps, reading even more into this, maybe this is why we see a lot of more interpersonal problems with BPD. That is, for many people, if they're not feeling it emotionally, there might be this tendency to withdraw more. But for our BPD folks, we don't really see that. It doesn't matter one way or the other, the same kind of level of negative affect. Okay. So, I've taken you on a little trip here through some devices that we have used in trying to tease apart or characterize affective instability, interpersonal problems, and how the two may interact with each other in this sample of borderline personality disordered individuals where they have a lot of interpersonal problems, a lot of affective dysregulation. What I'm going to do the rest of the time here is talk about some stuff that we have in progress and maybe things that I think might happen in the future, at least maybe in my future and nobody else's future. But the emphasis, again, is on, I'm very interested in, doing laboratory-based assessments, but also going from the lab out into the wild and trying to test some of the hypotheses, collecting data as people live their normal lives. And as they interact with other people, their social network and so forth, because that's really where we're going to be able to get a better sense of what's going on. Now, this is not a new idea. It's just, I think now we have the technology available to us where we can do a better job of it. So it's not like no one's ever had this idea before. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, it'd be great if we could follow people around all the time, but who has time for that? Well, we have a lot of passive sensors and also sort of active technologies where we can collect data on people out in the real world. Ultimately, I'm not going to talk about this at all, but there are already people that are using these sorts of data to develop ecological momentary interventions. Now, why would you do that? Well, when you think about it, if you're trying to help somebody, treat someone, the traditional way of doing it, they come in once a week, they tell you about, and this is still good, there's nothing wrong with it, but you kind of review what happened, what you might do the next time, and so forth. People tend to need the most help in the moment when they're out in their day, right, when something's happening, when the bad stuff is going down, right? So the idea behind this is that based upon some of the data that we collect in the moment, we can, okay, stick with me, we can write algorithms perhaps to then send an alert, which then might either have somebody call the person, which would take a lot of resources, but what's more typical is that sending text messages to individuals to remind them about the coping skills that they have already learned and that they might implement in that situation. So that's kind of where things are starting to head, and again, I think it's a very exciting field right now for that reason. What's also changed is that everyone loves their smartphone, but the smartphone, in my view, is just a computer that you just happen to talk with, the way the smartphones are now. Everyone, or most of the people now in the US have smartphones. There's even a higher adoption rate in some Asian countries, and it's predicted by 2014 there are going to be 1.8 billion smartphone users. And the unique thing about the smartphone is that it has many built-in sensors that you probably aren't even aware of in some cases. There are light sensors, proximity sensors. You have a 3-axis accelerometer. So by getting the data that your smartphone is collecting, I can probably predict your activity, whether you're sitting, running, bending over, kicking a speaker, whatever. I probably can tell that. And most importantly, these have Bluetooth sensors. You're probably more familiar with that because you're playing your music with them, and that's a cool thing. But there are other things you can do with Bluetooth. Because of that Bluetooth capability, we can link data from other sensors to the smartphone, okay? So the smartphone now is really just an access point. That's the way I see it, in a body area network. It can collect data by itself. You can be prompted to fill out self-reports on yourself, and it can also collect physiological data in real time, as it turns out. There's also GPS capabilities if you want to track location and time. I'm not even going to get into digital cameras and video recorders, but we have people, perhaps they might narrate after a very negative interpersonal event what happened, and so it's a better report because it's closer in proximity to that, perhaps audio and input, output, and recording. These are the phones that we're using. Yes, I get $100 for every Google phone that you buy, so please buy them. No, I don't, actually. But they're pretty cool. And in this one project that we're just starting up, we're looking at craving. We're looking at large emotion dysregulation, craving, and alcohol use. And so you can see on the person's smartphone that we give to them, or assign to them, I should say. In the morning, they can fill out a morning report on what happened last evening. If they have a drink, they go into this mode. If they have a big mood change, they start in this module, a craving episode here. So basically there, we have the self-report part. Much like with our electronic diaries and those ugly little Palm Pilots, you can do that on the mobile phone or the smartphone very easily. But the smartphones can do so much more than that. We also are simultaneously collecting data with something called the Q sensor, which actually I have one on right now, and I was going to try to stream it Bluetooth and show you how anxious I was at the, but I couldn't get it to work. But it does work, just not in this room. But these you wear on your wrist, and basically they measure electrodermal activity. Why is that important? Well, emotional arousal, you can see that in electrodermal activity. It also has a 3-axis accelerometer, so I can tell what activity and I can correct for activity. It also measures temperature, so I can control for temperature as well. What I don't have on right now, although you would never know, I could say I do have it on, perhaps, is this chest strap, which, besides being fashionable, measures your mini cardiac measures, so heart rate variability, which is extremely important in emotion regulation, and also respiration. And although we're not going to do it, you can measure some other things else with the external sensors, but that can be used as well in this kind of system. And then just today, I saw this, the Zen sensor, which immediately, of course, I had to check it out. This is measuring cardiac activity with the clip on the earlobe, Bluetooth. So already, just in a year since I bought the big expensive chest strap, there are some devices, and of course you'd want to validate these, but it might be less burdensome, just to clip something on your ear, because, like, of course, everyone at the airport has the Bluetooth on, so it might not look as weird as the strap, or not be more comfortable, perhaps. But my point here is just that almost every day, that's an exaggeration, every month, let's say, there are new devices coming out, because mobile health, there's a just large initiative to basically, and it's coming a lot from the medical profession, but to be able to assess people in their biological, physiological state as they're living their lives and getting those data. So more and more of this is going to be possible. What do you do with all this? Well, the first thing you do is you collaborate with people from computer science, which I'm doing. So they help me out with a lot of this. But basically, our model here is we have external sensors like this that communicate with our smartphone. We have smartphone sensors, and people can fill out self-reports on the phone. So we have all those data that are sent to our server in near real time. And then what do we do with that? Well, one thing you can do with that before, like I said, you could formulate or develop some kind of intervention based upon some physiological self-report profile that would trigger something to send a text message or something like that to tell people to use certain skills. But what we're also interested in is actually going back to the lab. So we've already gone out into the wild, but go back into the lab, and some of the standard kind of laboratory stimuli that are kind of tried and true stuff, where you have kind of hardwired psychophysiological equipment measuring physiological activity, we have people wearing these devices at the same time as they're being hooked up, and essentially, one thing is to see, are they sensitive enough to pick up on this stuff, whether it's the IAP slide, seeing scary faces, or movies that invoke moods, whatever. We also then collect that data from these ambulatory sensors, and we come up with some prediction algorithm for a mood state or some other kind of state out in the real world. We then release them into the real world, into the wild. And when that profile is matched, there's a prompting on the phone, and they report what's going on. And then based upon that feedback, whether it's right or wrong, we then can refine our model and do this again and again, such that ideally the end result is that we'd be able to predict for each individual when they're having large mood changes, craving episodes, maybe even fights with their spouse. I don't know. That may be too hard to predict. So that's, I think, where at least we're headed with a lot of this technology. So just to summarize here, we did talk about sort of the content. I guess my argument is that whenever you're measuring unstable processes, you need to use appropriate measures. And I would say interpersonal relations with others, affect regulation or dysregulation, that would also be a potentially unstable process. And I think these kind of methods have a lot to offer because, again, we have repeated measurements over time, so we can track changes. People are giving us data while they're in their natural environment. So this is really where things are happening. It's not what they're telling us about or when they're sitting talking to you as your their therapist or whatever. But we can collect this data on interpersonal stuff and emotion dysregulation in the natural environment. That temporal sequencing is very important, and I think now thinking about the mobile phone is for researchers and ultimately clinicians as well as sort of an access point to collect the data and also to communicate with the person, maybe actually deliver some interventions ultimately is a possibility too. So I want to thank the people that give me money, of course, and then there are a lot of people responsible for a lot of this stuff, the data and the ideas here. Sungmin, he's come back from South Korea for a sabbatical, so that's great, but he worked with me from the quant area for about 4 or 5 years. Phil, Tom, Piaseki's been very influential in this stuff. Kenny, Dave Watson, etc. And then past and also present graduate students have been very much involved in all aspects of this work, collecting the data, analyzing the data, bouncing ideas off of, and so forth. So, thank you very much. Yeah.
You might think that the act of responding to prompts on a Palm Pilot would make a person become more aware of their emotional state, doing this many times a day. Did you find that there was therapeutic values in participating?
Anecdotally, people have told us, they've thanked us for being in the study. They feel like they understand themselves more. We still find that, in fact, some of my students now are looking at what we call, there's something called emotional granularity, which means that you're able to tease apart like emotions. So within negative affect, you can tell there's a difference between sadness and hostility and so forth. It turns out, I didn't talk about it much, but people with BPD are not very good at that at all. And in turn, what seems to happen is that they just have, whenever they feel emotionally aroused, it's confusing to them. They don't know how to respond, because if you don't know if it's sadness, hostility, or whatever. We see some of that going on throughout the course of the study. I mean, one piece of what you're asking is maybe reactivity, and sort of a tried and true behavioral thing is you get people to monitor themselves and they get better. So for drinking behaviors or whatever, you sometimes see this. For these negative moods, we don't see much evidence for that, where over the course of the study, people are reporting much lower levels of negative mood, as though they're getting relief from their friend, the Palm Pilot. I think people may get better at distinguishing between emotions, but their overall level of negative affect doesn't seem to be dropping. I guess that's how I'd answer it. Yeah.
I walked in a couple minutes late, so forgive me if you said this and I just missed it. But what you seem to be saying, in a sense, is that people with BPD have a pretty tough time kind of regulating emotion in a broad sense, but especially negative emotion. Is there evidence that they have difficulty in self-regulation in other domains, so more of a broad cognitive executive deficit? Or something?
Yes, in all domains.
Yeah.
It's a disorder of dysregulation, affective, cognitive, behavioral, and so forth. And I probably didn't say that, but I'll say I did. Yeah.
What is the prevalence in different sexes? Because I noticed in most of the studies, almost 90% women.
Good catch. This is an interesting issue, actually. Back years ago, when I was a grad student, we were taught to believe, essentially, and it was sometimes said that BPD is a disorder that women have and men don't often have. Now, why did people think that? Well, even beyond just the anecdotal, sort of in my clinic, the studies were based on clinical samples. Women are more likely to to go to outpatient clinics and so forth. And what's very interesting is that in the epidemiological studies, where they've looked at the general population, the level of BPD symptoms for men and women is pretty much identical. So what's the deal with the men that have this? They're not as often presenting for treatment. It's also possible that they get misdiagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. There's some good studies we look at histrionic PD and antisocial PD. Just changing the gender of the case, in people reading the case studies, clinicians will say, oh, if it's a female with these symptoms, they have histrionic, a male antisocial, the same exact symptoms. I think something like that would probably go on with BPD. So it may be some clinician bias, if you will, on gender. But to really directly answer your question, when you're doing studies in clinics, you're just that's kind of the game. And we try to balance it as much as possible, but it's very hard to get men with BPD into studies from when you're recruiting from clinics. Yeah.
It seems like a puzzle as to why there's this instability, and could there be a cognitive component such like that, if you have depression, you're blaming things on yourself, so it's kind of stable, and if you have this borderline personality disorder, you're blaming things on external events and other people, so therefore your mood is going to keep swinging depending on what happened to you. Mm-hmm.
I think that's possible. There are, Ryan's written on like attention deficits in BPD. So there are sort of cognitive deficits there that we see that are more characteristic of this disorder than others. So I think it's a whole host of things that are sort of collaborating or conspiring together to create, essentially, if you think subjectively or experientially, it's a chaotic world. Your moods are changing a lot. You don't know really how to control your mood state. It's not always clear why you're having these strong mood changes. You have impulsive feelings. You want, do stuff. And there are models, actually, of people that are in this kind of spiral of emotion dysregulation. One way to get out of that is to kind of do sort of drastic things like cutting on oneself or substance use or whatever, and it's just really to get out of that spiral. So it's a very, when you kind of put it all together, it seems like it's a very chaotic, unpredictable world. So whether you're talking about your moods or what you're doing or how people are reacting to you. Yeah?
I was wondering about the etiology of it, and like how early do people present typically? Is it related to attachment styles at all? It seemed like at the beginning, the way you described it, it sounded like disorganized attachments.
Yes.
You mentioned earlier.
Or ambivalent. Yeah, it is. I'm not an attachment theorist, but it can't, in my view, be distinguished from other forms of psychopathology based on attachment, because it's basically the worst attachment styles that you can think of. As far as the etiology of it, we've done behavior genetics studies where it looks like it's about, for these kind of this phenotypes, about 48%, has about 48% heritability. So there's certainly heritable components, which you probably could account for by some general things like neuroticism and impulsivity. There are theories about kind of what happens in early life. It's not everyone that's emotionally sensitive necessarily goes on to this. So there's some other things that happen. And so, for example, in Linehan's model, it's not just this emotion sensitivity, but it's an invalidating environment. So whether it's the caregivers, parents, whomever, they either are, not sort of tolerant of a kid's outbursts and invalidate that, or they ignore them or do something like that. And so it's that kind of combination, according to Linehan, that then leads to, the development of some of these symptoms. So it's both biological and environmental. Yeah.
Do you find any global temporal effects? Like Monday was particularly terrible.
What we do, which I didn't get into, was because I'm interested in instability, it sounds weird to say that all the time, but we took out any systematic trends in each person's data. So for example, if you're looking at drinking, weekends, you're probably going to get more drinking than weekdays. So you have to take that into account in your model. So for mood, we looked at time of day, day of the week, and weekday versus weekend. And if there were, in our models, we essentially created a residual of mood at each time by controlling for that. So that we thought would give us a better idea what is instability here. What can't be accounted for by just a prediction of, oh, it's Monday or it's the weekend. Because obviously, like, you're more likely to see your romantic partner in the evenings, maybe on the weekends, and so you wouldn't want to not take that into account if you're trying to make some general interpretation. Yeah?
I know that it's hindsight that they are BPD individuals, but I was wondering if anyone's done gender difference analyses when looking at the role of interpersonal relationships in this negative affect and instability. Because I'm thinking that, especially when you're talking about romantic relationships, the role of what a romantic relationship means and even how the partner is acting and what the one
Right.
individual expects, those can be completely different depending on if you're a male or female.
Yeah. Not to my knowledge. I know right now Stephanie Stepp, who is a former student of mine that's now at Western Psych, I'm on a grant with her where she's studying dyads with BPD. And so she might be able to see some of that kind of stuff. For the most part, they've studied individuals and taken them from clinics, so it's mainly, there haven't been enough to really compare, but people are now, with the technology and carrying Palm Pilots or phones, you can have partners report on each other and interactions, and so she's doing a study with BPD dyads, but I'm not aware of any literature-based looking at that, but that certainly would be very interesting. You don't want to assume kind of one size fits all, certainly, because there are gender roles and things like that. Yeah.
So you mentioned empathy deficits early in the talk. I was just wondering, how has that been looked at experimentally in this population? So what sort of...
Yeah. Often it is like theory of mind stuff. Or just looking at kind of pictures, slides, and it's like, what do you think this person is thinking? And interesting, I didn't get into it in that literature. There's a lot of kind of mixed results, but when you have more ecologically valid stuff, so they've now developed stimuli that aren't just kind of IAP slides, but slides of people in emotionally charged situations, or even movies with interpersonal kind of thing. They're getting more consistent results about kind of these deficits in either cognitive empathy, which would be, like tell me what this person's thinking, what's going on, or emotional empathy, kind of what emotions am I feeling based on kind of what they're doing. The more ecologically valid the stimuli, the more consistent results. And that makes some sense. And then also, for me at least, kind of highlights like why we need to go out into the wild. Because, again, there's nothing wrong with you study stuff in the lab. It gives you good ideas. But what we want to do is kind of take that from the lab out into the wild and kind of test it out into the wild. But also, at the same time, some stuff we might find in the wild, we can go back and test that in the lab, too. Because, obviously, there's a lot of confounding stuff that goes on in the wild. Colombia. Yeah.
Do these patients have a negativity bias of some sort? Are they projecting negative affect into the social environment? Is that part of what's going on here? That they have a kind of hypervigilance to social threat. So they're seeing these threats.
Yes.
That aren't really there.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, we do see that clinically and in research, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Has there been any investigation into possible genetic risk factors?
Yeah, well, the behavior genetic stuff, which is kind of the aggregate genetic, it's clear there's a genetic vulnerability for this, and we've looked at components of BPD, and it seems like they kind of load, like genetically, it's like one kind of BPD factor, so we don't see a lot of, like, oh, it's just AI, or it's just this. If you're talking about molecular genetics, that's a growing literature, but there are a lot of inconsistent results, primarily because they just don't have large enough N's to, it's kind of the classic thing with GY, all this stuff. Like, they're great studies, and they explain 1% of the variants, and no one ever replicates them again. So there's nothing real definitive at that level. But, I think most people, it's very clear that there's a genetic vulnerability for this kind of constellation of symptoms. Yeah.
Are there differences in the brain between someone with BPD and MDD?
Well, you mean the function of the brain or the structure? Not so much the structure necessarily, but there are some functional, people have looked at some functional difference. Unfortunately, for the most part, most of the fMRI studies, a lot of them have been like BPD versus healthy controls. I haven't seen a lot of studies that have compared them to other psychiatric groups, and which is too bad, because that's kind of why I did this one study. It's like, I'm pretty sure that if I gave Palm Pilots to people with BPD and people that had no psychopathology, I'm going to see differences. So why not do a kind of riskier test to see kind of what seems to be specific to BPD? And I'm not aware of studies that have done that with using imaging or anything like that. But there are a lot of actually imaging studies on BPD that are out there. Yeah?
You said the mean negative affect for the BPD and the major depressive disorder people was the same.
Yeah.
I guess that implies that the BPD also had higher positive states sometimes. Did you find find a positive lag effect?
No, we didn't find much with positive affect. It doesn't, the way that we measure positive and negative, they're separate scales. And so, in fact, we do see some kind of mixed mood where people report kind of high positive and high negative at the same time. Like, I'm not sure what that is, but that kind of feeds back into this idea about arousal. Like, I'm not sure what I'm feeling. But for these scales, we didn't find those kinds of differences or anything on positive affect, just with negative affect, as far as the instability and the variance. But the mean stuff was all similar across disorders. Okay, thanks.